All right, welcome everyone to the deep dive. Today we're going to jump headfirst into some pretty serious stuff. Recent talks between Russia and the U.S. in Riyadh. We've got a whole bunch of reports here that break down what happened, who was there, and the different sides to these diplomatic exchanges. And our job here is to get to the bottom of it.
Yeah, exactly. We're going to really dissect all these reports, get past all the noise and understand the context and try to figure out what it all means moving forward.
Okay, let's get into it then. So it looks like the main talks took place March 24th in Riyadh, Saudi Arabia. And get this, they lasted for like 12 hours. I mean, 12 hours, that's got to be a sign that some pretty serious issues were on the table, right?
Absolutely. 12 hours of talks, that's not just a meet and greet. That indicates a pretty loaded agenda, lots to talk about, and probably some pretty difficult negotiations.
And the main thing that brought these two sides together for so long, it seems like it was all about the safety of navigation in the Black Sea. Now, why was this such a big deal right now?
Yeah, so the Black Sea situation has really become a top priority for everyone involved. And it's interesting because this wasn't just something that popped up out of nowhere. It seems like Presidents Putin and Trump had already agreed to talk about this back on March 18th. So there was a mutual recognition of how important this is.
And now this is where things get really interesting. The reports say that Russia wants to get the Black Sea grain initiative back on track, but only if it's more acceptable to all. What do you make of that? What were they unhappy with in the old deal?
Well, that phrase, more acceptable to all, it's a loaded one for sure. It tells me that Russia wasn't at all satisfied with how the grain initiative worked before, and they're looking for some major changes. And they made it clear they want clear security guarantees if they're going to be part of it again. So the big question is, what exactly are those guarantees they're looking for?
Well, the reports say they see those guarantees as like a Washington order to Zelensky. That's pretty direct, maybe even a little provocative, right?
Yeah.
What does that tell us about how Russia sees Ukraine's role in all of this?
Yeah, that language, it suggests that Russia isn't looking for promises directly from Ukraine. They want assurances from the U.S., almost like they're saying Washington's calling the shots. It definitely hints at a lack of trust, maybe a feeling that deals made directly with Ukraine aren't enough. And they kept saying they need agreements without ambiguities, so they want things to be crystal clear, no wiggle room, and they believe the U.S. is the one who can deliver on that.
And the U.S. delegation in Riyadh, they seem to get that message loud and clear. They heard this signal, according to the reports. But does that mean they agree with how Russia's framing the whole thing?
Good question. Just because they heard it doesn't necessarily mean they buy it. It just means they understand what Russia's saying. Whether they agree with those demands or how to meet them, that's another story altogether. It's more like a starting point for negotiation, really.
Right. Of course, we can't talk about Black Sea navigation without considering the bigger picture here. It's a crucial route for the global grain market. Food supplies, fertilizers, the whole thing. And Russia wants things to be predictable. They don't want to be cut out of this market. And part of their reasoning seems to be concerns about food security, particularly in African countries. Why is this role in the global food market so important for Russia, especially right now?
Well, the Black Sea is like a major highway for global trade, especially when it comes to agriculture. And Russia is a major player in that arena. They're a key exporter, so naturally they want things to be stable and they don't want to be pushed out. And by talking about food security, especially in Africa, they're positioning themselves as a responsible player on the world stage, perhaps even trying to gain international support for their position.
And it's interesting how each side describes the topic of the talks. The Kremlin calls it the well-known initiative concerning the safety of navigation, but the White House called it a ceasefire in the Black Sea. It's the same thing, but those descriptions have really different vibes, What does that tell us about what each side wants to get out of this?
Absolutely. Safety of navigation, that sounds very technical, very narrow, like just making sure ships can move around safely. But a ceasefire in the Black Sea, that suggests a much bigger effort to de-escalate military activity in the whole area. Those different terms probably reflect totally different end goals. One side is focused on a specific problem, the other is thinking about a much broader peace strategy.
And one expert pointed out just how dangerous the Black Sea is right now. With all the warships, drones, naval aviation going on, it's a recipe for things to get out of hand, even by accident. And as we already said, it's also a vital shipping route. So what kind of mechanisms could they even put in place to make sure everyone's following the rules and lower the risk of something going wrong?
Yeah, that expert's comment really highlights the urgency of these talks. The Black Sea is a tinderbox right now. When we talk about verification mechanisms, we're talking about clear rules for how everyone moves their military stuff around, maybe setting up special communication channels so there are no misunderstandings, and even some kind of remote monitoring satellites, radar, to make sure everyone's playing by the rules.
Okay, let's talk about the Black Sea Grain Initiative itself. It sounds like Russia might be willing to get back on board, which is a big deal considering they pulled out before. But they want things to be different, more acceptable, as they said. So what made them walk away the first time, and how might that shape what they're demanding now?
Well, the fact that they're open to renewing it, even with changes, tells me they understand how important it is globally, and maybe they see how it can benefit their own agricultural exports too. This initiative, it ran for a whole year, and the goal was to create safe routes for Ukrainian grain exports, but also, and this is key, for Russia to lift restrictions on their own agricultural products and fertilizers. Their beef last year was that the parts of the deal that were supposed to help them weren't being honored. So all of that history is crucial to understanding why they're so insistent on clearer and more solid guarantees this time around.
So one of the big things they must have talked about in Riyadh is whether they were just focusing on making navigation safe right now, or if they were diving back into that whole grain deal and tackling those unmet demands from before. Initially, it seemed like safety was the top priority, but, Russia wasn't going to let those past issues slide. How likely is it that Russia would agree to just a navigation safety agreement without also getting some wins on their agricultural exports?
It's all connected, right? While the immediate focus might have been on the technical stuff about safe navigation, Russia's bigger concerns about the Green Deal, especially the parts that affect their bottom line, those were probably looming large over the whole conversation. I think it's pretty safe to say that Russia wouldn't see progress on navigation safety as separate from their export interests. They're probably aiming for a deal that addresses both the immediate safety issues and ensures the whole grain export system works better for them in the long run.
Okay, let's try to understand how the U.S. was approaching these talks and what they thought a solution might look like. Apparently, they planned these Riyadh meetings as a way to have indirect negotiations between Moscow and Kyiv, with the U.S. acting as a middleman, going back and forth between the two sides in separate rooms. But since the meetings with Russia and Ukraine were on different days, did this shuttle diplomacy really work as planned?
Yeah, the whole indirect negotiations thing shows that the U.S. is trying to act as a go-between for Russia and Ukraine, trying to find some common ground without them having to talk face-to-face. By meeting with them separately, they were probably hoping to figure out where each side absolutely wouldn't budge and then see if there was any wiggle room for compromise. But yeah, having the meetings on different days, that probably changed the dynamic a bit. It wasn't really a back and forth in real time, more like a series of separate consultations.
The reports say that the U.S. was hoping for a positive statement to come out after their meeting with Russia. Even if it wasn't a concrete agreement, what kind of impact could a statement like that have had?
Even without any hard commitments, a positive statement would have been a big deal. It would have shown that both sides are willing to keep talking and maybe even highlighted some areas where they agree. It would have helped create a more positive atmosphere for future negotiations. So the fact that the U.S. was hoping for that really shows how important it was for them to see some kind of progress, even a small one.
And there was a whole multi-step plan, almost like an algorithm, laid out by the U.S. for a bigger settlement. First up was a ceasefire in the air, meaning they both agree not to attack each other's energy infrastructure for 30 days. Russia says they started this on March 18th and that Ukraine agreed. But the White House, they described it a bit differently, saying it was an agreement that the move towards peace would start with a ceasefire on energy and infrastructure. Why the subtle difference in how they're explaining this first step?
Well, those different ways of describing the same thing, it probably comes down to each side wanting to control the narrative. Russia saying it was their idea and that Ukraine went along with it, that makes them look like the peacemakers. The White House saying it was a mutual agreement, that sounds more like cooperation, like they're both working together. But regardless of how they spin it, the main thing is that they both agree to stop attacking critical infrastructure for a while. That builds trust, and it creates space for more talks.
Right. The next step in the U.S. plan was a ceasefire in the Black Sea. This would let both sides ship grain, fuel, and basically start trading again. And the reports even said this could lead to real progress, maybe even a full ceasefire down the line. But given all the tension and mistrust, was it really realistic to expect real progress that quickly?
The Black Sea ceasefire, that's definitely a major piece of the puzzle, and it's a big ask. But making sure commercial ships can move around safely, they're hoping to address the immediate economic problems and hopefully create some momentum towards de-escalation. Maybe they were thinking back to the grain initiative, even though it wasn't perfect. But let's be real, with all the military activity in the Black Sea and the lack of trust, expecting things to change overnight, that's probably a bit too optimistic. It would take some serious concessions from both sides, and they'd both have to be truly committed to making it work.
Then the third stage in the U.S. plan was all about discussing the line of control. This means figuring out where the lines are drawn on the ground, setting up ways to make sure everyone's following the rules, maybe bringing in peacekeeping forces, and basically freezing the conflict where it is. What are some of the biggest obstacles to even starting to talk about things like that?
Talking about the line of control, that's a minefield, both literally and figuratively. You've got to get both sides to agree on where that line even is and then figure out how to make sure they're both respecting it. That means international observers, satellite monitoring, inspections on the ground, the whole 9 yards. And then there's the question of peacekeeping forces. Who provides them? What's their mission? And will everyone accept them? Plus, freezing the lines means accepting the current situation, which is probably a very hard pill to swallow for Ukraine.
And finally, the U.S. imagined a permanent peace agreement where they talk about territory in exchange for guarantees that Ukraine will be safe and secure. This sounds like the hardest part of all, right? What kind of huge disagreements will they have to overcome to even start having a serious conversation about this?
This last stage, it goes to the heart of the whole conflict. We're talking about fundamental disagreements about who controls what land, what Ukraine's future looks like, and how to guarantee their security. The idea of territory in exchange for peace and security guarantees, it raises so many tough questions. What would each side be willing to give up? What would those security guarantees actually look like? Who would be responsible for enforcing them? Overcoming all the deeply held beliefs and historical baggage, that's a monumental task.
Now let's talk about Ukraine's role in all of this. We know the U.S. talked to them separately on March 23rd, before the talks with Russia, and again on March 25th, after the talks. What does this tell us about how much the U.S. and Ukraine were coordinating and sharing information during this whole process?
The fact that they had these separate talks with Ukraine shows that it's a three-way conversation, even though Russia and Ukraine weren't talking directly in Riyadh. By talking to Ukraine separately, the U.S. could hear their thoughts, their priorities, their demands, without Russia being in the room. It suggests that the U.S. was committed to keeping Ukraine in the loop, even if the negotiations were indirect.
It seems like Ukraine's main goals were to figure out what a ceasefire might look like, and to give the U.S. a list of infrastructure they wanted protected from attacks. What does that tell us about what Ukraine is most worried about right now in the middle of all these bigger discussions?
It tells me that Ukraine is being proactive, trying to get concrete security guarantees in the short term by laying out their red lines for a ceasefire and saying exactly which infrastructure they need protected. They're trying to have a direct impact on the negotiations, making sure their most urgent vulnerabilities are addressed.
And the reports say that when the U.S. and Ukraine talked about protecting energy and other infrastructure, there were energy experts and military representatives from Ukraine in the room. Why was it so important to have those specific experts there?
Having those experts there, it shows that Ukraine's concerns about security are very real and very practical. Protecting energy infrastructure, that's become a top priority because of the attacks. And having military personnel there, it underscores the security implications of everything they're talking about. These experts bring essential knowledge to the table. They can identify vulnerabilities and suggest ways to protect things.
And it wasn't all about infrastructure. The U.S. and Ukraine also talk about maritime security, which is obviously connected to the Black Sea. And they also discuss the return of Ukrainian children and prisoner exchanges. That's a pretty wide-ranging agenda. What does it tell us about the bigger picture of the U.S.-Ukraine dialogue?
Yeah, it shows that they're taking a comprehensive approach. They're not just talking about the immediate security stuff like infrastructure in the Black Sea, but also those crucial humanitarian issues, getting those children back and arranging prisoner exchanges. It really emphasizes how this conflict affects everything and how many different issues need to be addressed if there's going to be any real solution.
They even talked about a specific proposal for a ceasefire that only applies to ships and ports. Ukraine wouldn't attack Russian ships on the sea or rivers, and in return, Russia wouldn't attack Ukrainian ships or ports, specifically mentioning Kherson, Mykolaiv, and the ports around Odessa. And the idea is that they'd have regular technical meetings to make sure it's working. How big of a deal could a localized ceasefire like that be, considering the bigger picture of the conflict?
That kind of ceasefire focused on the sea, that could be a really significant step.
Hmm.
If they can create a safe zone for ships in those important Ukrainian ports, that could get trade flowing again, including grain exports, and help ease some of the economic pressure. And the fact that they're talking about regular meetings to make sure it works, that suggests they're serious about making it stick and maybe even expanding it. It could be a major step towards building trust and maybe even de-escalating things in other areas.
Let's talk about something else that came up, Ukraine's possible membership in NATO. The reports say that Hungary, Germany, Slovakia, and even the U.S. have some concerns about Ukraine joining NATO right now. They also point out that everyone in NATO has to agree for a new country to join, and it's pretty much impossible for that to happen while there's a war going on. So why is there still so much debate and disagreement within NATO about this?
It's complicated. It comes down to how NATO handles adding new members, especially when you're talking about a country in the middle of a major conflict. NATO has said they're committed to letting Ukraine join eventually, but bringing them in right now, when things are so volatile, that triggers all sorts of worries for some NATO countries. They're worried about Article 5, which means if one member is attacked, everyone else has to jump in and help. So some countries are hesitant because they're thinking about the bigger strategic picture and the risks involved.
We can't forget that Ukraine officially applied to join NATO back in the fall of 2022, and NATO has kept saying that they will let Ukraine in at some point. They even said that Ukraine's path to being fully integrated with Europe and the Atlantic is irreversible. How does that commitment fit with the fact that they're hesitating about letting them join right now?
Ukraine applied because they want those strong security guarantees, and NATO keeps saying they'll let them in eventually because that's part of their long-term strategy in the region. But this hesitation about immediate membership, it's about acknowledging the very real dangers and practical issues of adding a country in the middle of a war. They're essentially saying, we're with you for the long haul, but right now we need to be cautious.
And on the other side, Russia has said over and over again that they'll only end the fighting if Ukraine promises never to join NATO, and if Ukraine pulls their military forces out of certain areas. It sounds like those are deal breakers for Russia. So how do those demands clash with what Ukraine wants and what NATO has said they'll do?
Those are totally incompatible positions. Russia's demands completely go against Ukraine's right to decide their own alliances and NATO's open door policy. Ukraine sees joining NATO as the best way to protect themselves from Russia in the long term. Russia, on the other hand, sees NATO getting closer to their borders as a huge threat to their own security. These are fundamentally opposing views, and that's a massive roadblock to any kind of lasting peace agreement.
One report even quoted a Russian official saying that refusing to talk to Russia and pushing for Ukraine to join NATO is a colossal mistake by both the last U.S. administration and the current one. That's a pretty harsh statement. What's the thinking behind that kind of criticism from Russia?
It all boils down to Russia's deep opposition to NATO expansion, which they see as a direct challenge to their influence and their security. By calling it a colossal mistake, they're not just disagreeing, they're trying to put pressure on the U.S. to change course and to influence Ukraine's choices. It's all rooted in Russia's history, their sense of grievance, and their determination to maintain a certain level of control in the region.
And after that marathon 12-hour meeting in Riyadh, a Russian senator said they couldn't agree on a joint statement because of Ukraine's position, which he called characteristic and symptomatic. What does that even mean? What's he getting at?
Well, if they couldn't agree on a joint statement, and it was supposedly because of Ukraine, that means there are still big differences even after all those talks between the U.S. and Russia. And the fact that the senator called it characteristic and symptomatic, that suggests Russia thinks this is typical of Ukraine, that they're not willing to compromise or see things their way. It just highlights how deep the divide is.
Okay, so what happens now? We know that the people who were at the talks, both from Russia and the U.S., are reporting back to their presidents. What kind of decisions or actions might we see after those briefings?
Well, the fact that they're briefing their presidents directly shows how important these talks were. It tells me that any big decisions or changes in strategy will probably be made at the very top. So I'd say we'll see both sides reviewing what happened, analyzing the situation, and then maybe more diplomatic efforts at different levels to see if they can build on what was discussed or address the stuff they couldn't agree on.
We also know that they're keeping the specifics of the negotiations under wraps. They say it was mostly technical stuff, and they're still analyzing it all. That secrecy tells me they're dealing with some very sensitive issues. Why is it so common to keep things quiet in the early stages of these kinds of talks?
It's a pretty standard practice when you're dealing with delicate diplomatic issues. Those technical talks probably involved a lot of back and forth about specific proposals and possible compromises. Going public with all that too soon could really mess things up, cause misunderstandings, and make it harder for everyone to find common ground. Keeping things confidential allows them to be more open and honest without the pressure of the public watching their every move.
But Russia has said publicly that they want to keep talking to Washington. And they mentioned bringing in the UN, maybe other countries too. What does that tell us about how Russia wants to handle things from here on out?
Bringing in the UN and other countries, that suggests Russia wants to make this a more multilateral discussion. It could be a way to legitimize any agreements they reach, to bring different perspectives into the mix, and maybe even to exert some influence through those other players. It tells me they don't see this as just a Russia-US issue anymore. They want to broaden the conversation.
And here's another interesting thing. The reports say there are no plans right now for any meetings between the top leaders or any three-way meetings with Ukraine included. It seems like they're still sticking with these indirect talks for now. What could be the reason for not jumping into those higher-level face-to-face meetings at this point?
It could be that everyone's still feeling things out. Maybe they need more time to lay the groundwork in those technical discussions to find more common ground before the presidents or other top officials get directly involved. It could also be that they're still not on the same page about who should be involved and what the format should be for future talks.
And lastly, we got some information about who was actually at the talks in Riyadh. The Russian delegation included Grigory Karasin and Sergei Beseda. The U.S. team reportedly included Andrew Peake and Michael Anton, along with some aides to Keith Kellogg and people representing Mike Waltz. Considering the experience and expertise of these people, what does that tell us about how seriously both sides were taking these consultations?
Well, when you see a lineup like that with seasoned diplomats, security experts, people who've been dealing with foreign policy for years, it's clear that both Russia and the U.S. sent their A-team. They weren't messing around. The fact that they sent people with such deep knowledge of these issues suggests they were ready to have some serious, in-depth conversations about the technical and strategic aspects of the situation.
And to wrap things up, one of the Russians who was at the talks described them as intense, not simple, but very useful for both sides. He said they covered a lot of ground, but obviously didn't agree on everything. He also said the timing of the talks was important because of the new administration and the new faces in Washington. What are the key takeaways from this insider's view of the discussions?
That insider perspective is really valuable. Intense and not simple. That tells us it wasn't easy, there were some tough disagreements, but calling it very useful and pointing out the significance of the timing with the new administration in the U.S., that suggests they see potential for moving forward, even if it's a long road. It sounds like they believe these talks, even without any major breakthroughs, were an important step for everyone involved, a way to start navigating a very complicated and ever-changing situation.
So what does this all mean for the average person out there? These discussions in Riyadh, they give us a glimpse into how diplomacy works, how countries try to deal with these huge global issues, especially in the Black Sea region right now. The focus is on making navigation safe and maybe reviving that grain initiative, but there's so many different perspectives and so much mistrust that it's a really delicate process. The fact that these talks are happening at all, though, shows that both sides know how important it is to keep talking, especially in such a tense geopolitical environment. They're trying to balance immediate practical concerns with these long-standing strategic disagreements, and all this behind-the-scenes analysis and involvement of multiple players. It just highlights how complex international diplomacy really is, especially when the stakes are so high.
Couldn't have said it better myself. It's a real balancing act, that's for sure.
Subscribe to our podcast on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and YouTube. We are here to make things clear. New episodes every day.